Hey Smokey, how's it going? Let me know how I sound because I had to adjust a few things, so I'm a little worried about it. Suppose I could probably just listen to myself. I hate doing that though. Hi Dave. No, no dolphins today. I did eat salmon though. I need to find some whale hunting simulator game or something. That would be hilarious. I think I could probably make myself a little louder. All right. Give me just one more moment and I'll switch things and we'll get started. Okay, hopefully I still sound all right. Is it still a bit quiet? I can turn it up a little more. Let me know if that's any better. Because I was on something the other day and they asked me to turn it down because apparently I was louder than everybody else. So. Better? There's one thing here on my desk somewhere that I'm looking for, and I don't see it. Found it. Actually, I could probably turn it up a little more here. There. Thank you, Silver. Yeah, I always try to include the links in the second post. Oh, for those who haven't heard, the news is good. I am now part of the YouTube partner program. So I've got memberships all set up. We already have some lovely members. Silver, for example. Smokey. Um, 3 tiers. You know, the basic tier, and then one with memberships and videos, and then the other one and stuff. So, um, information's all there. I appreciate everyone so much for helping me get there. I can't even begin to thank you all. Hey Sherry, how's it going? Done the last part of your crypto phase? A happy ending? That means you made money. Congratulations. Hey Wick. We get a few more members. I can add some more emotes, that kind of thing. So, is the music coming through okay? Kind of looking like a no. No, it's definitely not coming through okay. Now it should be. Oh God, that coffee, that tea is nasty. Yes, Avery, we are indeed reading tonight. Yeah, you should be able to hear it now. It's really quiet music. It's just a nice ambiance. Hey, Drama Goblin. Yeah, I got a new makeover. So, for any of you who speak Spanish, I'm going to apologize now. There's a Spanish portion in this book, and I don't speak Spanish. So, my accent's going to be terrible. But I'll do my best. All right, so tonight we're doing the Mound with Zealia Bishop. I've read through part of it already. It's a very interesting story so far. Well, this is part 1, so we'll be starting at the beginning together. But that's okay. Yeah, you forgot to tell you. Stopak Rodriguez. He back again. Yeah, I love. Those were good tunes. All right, here we go. It is only within the last few years that most people have stopped thinking of the West as a new land. I suppose the idea gained ground because of our own special civilization happens to be new there. But nowadays, explorers are digging beneath the surface and bringing up whole chapters of life that rose and fell among these plains and mountains before recorded history began. We think nothing of a Pueblo village 2,500 years old, and it hardly jolts us when archaeologists put the sub-pedigral culture of Mexico back to 17,000 or 18,000 BC. We hear rumors of still older things too, of primitive man contemporaneous with extinct animals and known today only through a few fragmentary bones and artifacts, so that the idea of newness is fading out pretty rapidly. Europeans usually catch the sense of immemorial ancientness and deep deposits from successive life streams better than we do. Only a couple years ago, a British author spoke of Arizona as a moon-dim region, very lovely in its way, and stark and old, an ancient and lonely land. Yeah, this is like lemon echinacea. It's supposed to be throat coating. I was hoping maybe it would help me read. Not tasty. Not tasty at all. Do not recommend. Yet I believe I have a deeper sense of the stupefying, almost horrible ancientness of the West than any European. It comes from an incident that happened in 1928, an incident which I'd greatly like to dismiss as three-quarters hallucination, but which has left a frightfully firm impression on my mind that I can't put it off very easily. It was in Oklahoma, where my work as an American Indian and ethnologist constantly takes me, and where I'd come upon some devilishly strange and disconcerting matters before. Make no mistake, Oklahoma is a lot more than a mere pioneers and promoters frontier. Oh, shit. I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to have to take a second here because, holy one moment. I gotta look here. Oh, of course, I put my keyboard away because I'm reading. Wookie, holy shit, man. Wookie very kindly came in here and just gifted 10 subs to the people. So thank you very much. I very much appreciate that. It took me a second to find where it said who did it. No, Stream Elements is fine. It's a little shocked, I think, but it's fine. Sitting here doing my reading and catch that scroll out of the corner of my eye. Panicked for a small second there. But damn, Wookie, thank you so much. Okay, things are moving again and I'm getting scared. Wookie, that's 20. Man, thank you. Fuck. You're too kind. Yes, that was twice. He walks in here and just, in the middle of reading, drops everybody a sponsorship, so... Dude, man, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. I really gotta find a sound or some shit for that. That's part of what I... After we're done here later, guys, I'm gonna put a community note thing. Please, if you have any suggestions for sounds on donations... Yeah, Wookie kicked in the cantina door. Wookie walked in and just tore open the ethereal portal between our dimension and yours and walked on through like Cthulhu doesn't fucking matter. Yeah, oh, thank you, Wookie. Goddamn. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. I can tell everybody how much I don't appreciate this tea. Ugh. Now I don't remember where I left off. You sacrificed 20 souls. Yum, yum, yum. Feed the Cthulhu monster. That is... Wookie, you're fucking amazing. Hot Jello's good for... Isn't that just hot Kool-Aid? No, Avery, I'm just sitting here reading and then all of a sudden my screen starts scrolling through the corner of my eye. And I'm like, shit, did I get attacked by somebody? Something going on here? And then no, it's just Wookie coming in being awesome. Dude, thank you again so much. I know you're not feeling well. I really appreciate it. Feel better, man. I'm gonna read now. Echinacea and chamomile both just make me pee a lot. This is lemon and echinacea. I've never had echinacea before. It tastes nasty. Or it's the licorice. I hate licorice. It's so hard to get tea without licorice. Anyway. Thank you again, Wookie. God damn it. Anyway, where was I? I'm just going to start from here. Make no mistake, Oklahoma is a lot more than a mere pioneers and promoters frontier. There are old tribes with old memories there. And when the tom-toms beat ceaselessly over brooding plains in the autumn, the spirits of men are brought dangerously close to primal, whispered things. I am white and eastern myself, but anyone is welcome to know that the rights of Yig, father of snakes, can get a real shudder out of me any day. I have heard and seen too much to be sophisticated in such matters, and it is with this incident of 1928 I'd like to laugh it off, but can't. I had gone into Oklahoma to track down and correlate one of the many ghost tales which were current among the white settlers, but which had strong Indian corroboration, and I felt sure, an ultimate Indian source. They were very curious and open-air ghost tales, and though they sounded flat and prosaic in the mouths of the white people, they had the earmarks of linkage with some of the richest and obscurest phases of native mythology. All of them were woven around the vast, lonely, artificial-looking mounds in the western part of the state, and all of them involved apparitions of exceedingly strange aspect and equipment. The commonest, and among the oldest, became quite famous in 1892, when a government marshal named John Willis went into the Mound region after horse thieves and came out with a wild yarn of nocturnal cavalry horses in the air between the great armies of invisible specters. Battles that involved the rush of hooves and feet, the thud of blows, the clank of metal on metal, the cries of warriors, and the fall of human and equine bodies. These things happened by moonlight and frightened his horse as well as himself. The sounds persisted an hour at a time, vivid but subdued, as if brought from a distance by the wind and unaccompanied by any glimpse of the armies themselves. Later on, Willis learned that the seat of the sound was a notoriously haunted spot, shunned by settlers and Indians alike. Many had seen, or half seen, the warring horsemen in the sky, and had furnished dim, ambiguous descriptions. The settlers described the ghostly fighters as Indians, though of no familiar tribe, and having the most singular costumes and weapons. They even went so far as to say that they could not be sure the horses were really horses. The Indians, on the other hand, did not seem to claim the specters as kinsfolk. They referred to them as those people, the old people, or they who dwell below, and appeared to hold them in too great a frightened veneration to talk much about them. No ethnologist had been able to pin any tale teller down to a specific description of the beings, and apparently nobody had ever had a very clear look at them. The Indians had one or two old proverbs about these phenomena, saying that men very old make very big spirit, not so old, not so big, older than all time, than spirit he so big he near flesh. Those old people and spirits they mix up, get all the same. Now all of this, of course, is old stuff to an ethnologist, of a piece with the persistent legends of rich hidden cities and buried races which abound among the Pueblo Plains Indians, and which lured Coronado centuries ago on his vain search for the fabled Quivira. What took me into western Oklahoma was something far more definite and tangible. A local and distinctive tale, though really old, and was wholly new to the outside world of research, and which involved the first clear descriptions of the ghosts which it treated of. There was an added thrill to the fact that it came from the remote town of Binger in Caddo County, a place I had long known as the scene of a very terrible and partly inexplicable occurrence connected with the snake god myth. The tale, outwardly, was an extremely naive and simple one, and centered in a huge lone mound or small hill that rose above the plain about a third of a mile west of the village. A mound which some thought a product of nature, but which others believed to be a burial place or a ceremonial dais constructed by prehistoric tribes. The mound, the villagers said, was constantly haunted by two Indian figures which appeared in alternation. An old man who paced back and forth along the top from dawn till dusk, regardless of the weather and with only brief intervals of disappearance, and a squaw who took his place at night with a blue-flamed torch that glimmered quite continuously until morning. When the moon was bright, the squaw's peculiar figure could be seen fairly plainly, and over half the villagers agreed that the apparition was headless. Local opinion was divided as to the motives and relative ghostliness of the two visions. Some held that the man was not a ghost at all, but a living Indian who had killed and beheaded a squaw for gold and buried her somewhere on the mound. According to these theorists, he was pacing the eminence through sheer remorse, bound by the spirit of his victim, which took visible shape after dark. But other theorists, more uniform in their spectral beliefs, held that both man and woman were ghosts, the man having killed the squaw and himself as well at some very distant period. These and minor variant versions seem to have been current ever since the settlement of Wichita County in 1889, and were, I was told, sustained to an astonishing degree by still existing phenomena which anyone might observe for himself. Not many ghost tales offer such free and open proof, and I was very eager to see what bizarre wonders might be lurking in this small, obscure village, so far from the beaten path of crowds and from the ruthless searchlights of scientific knowledge. So in the late summer of 1928, I took a train for Bingor and brooded on strange mysteries as the cars rattled timidly along their single track through a lonelier and lonelier landscape. Bingor is a modest cluster of frame houses and stores in the midst of a flat, windy region full of clouds of red dust. There are about 500 inhabitants beside the Indians on a neighboring reservation, the principal occupation seeming to be agriculture. The soil is decently fertile, and the oil boom has not reached this part of the state. My train drew in at twilight, and I felt rather lost and uneasy, cut off from the wholesome and everyday things, as it pulled away to the southward without me. The station platform was filled with curious loafers, all of whom seemed eager to direct me when I asked for the man whom I had letters of introduction. I was ushered along a commonplace main street whose redded surface was red with the sandstone soil of the country, and finally delivered at the door of my prospective host. Those who had arranged things for me had done well, for Mr. Compton was a man of high intelligence and local responsibility, while his mother, who lived with him and was familiarly known as Grandma Compton, was one of the first pioneer generation and a veritable mine of anecdote and folklore. Hey, Metastep! The evening the Comptons summed up for me all the legends current among the villagers, proving that the phenomenon I had come to study was indeed a baffling and important one. The ghosts, it seems, were accepted almost as a matter of course by everyone in Bingor. 2 generations had been born and grown up within sight of that queer, lonely tumulus and its restless figures. The neighborhood of the mound was naturally feared and shunned, so that the village and the farms had not spread towards it in all 4 decades of settlement. Yet venturesome individuals had several times visited it. Some had come back to report they saw no ghosts at all when they neared the dreaded hill, that somehow the lonely sentinel had stepped out of sight before they reached the spot, leaving them free to climb the steep slope and explore the flat summit. There was nothing up there, they said, merely a rough expanse of underbrush. Where the Indian watcher could have vanished to, they had no idea. He must, they reflected, have descended the slope and somehow managed to escape unseen along the plain, although there was no convenient cover within sight. At any rate, there did not appear to be any opening in into the mound, a conclusion which was reached after considerable exploration of the shrubbery and tall grasses on all sides. In a few cases, some of the more sensitive searchers declared that they felt a sort of invisible restraining presence, but they could describe nothing more definite than that. It was simply as if the air thickened against them in the direction they wished to move. It is needless to mention that all these daring surveys were conducted by day. Nothing in the universe could have induced any human being, white or red, to approach that sinister elevation after dark, and indeed, no Indian would have thought of going near it even in the brightest sunlight. You are both already subbed. No worries, Meta. You can always listen to it from the beginning later. I appreciate you being here. Hi, Sleazy. But it was not from the tales of these sane, observant seekers that the chief terror of the ghost mound sprang. Indeed, and had their experience been typical, the phenomenon would have bulked far less prominently in local legendary. The most evil thing was the fact that many other seekers had come back strangely impaired in mind and body, or had not come back at all. The first of these cases had occurred in 1891, when a young man named Heaton had gone with a shovel to see what hidden secrets he could unearth. He had heard curious tales from the Indians, and had laughed at the barren report of another youth who had been out to the mound and had found nothing. Heaton had watched the mound with a spyglass from the village while the other youth made his trip, and as the explorer neared the spot, he saw the sentinel Indian walk deliberately down into the tumulus as if a trap door and staircase existed on the top. The other youth had not noticed how the Indian disappeared, but had merely found him gone upon arriving at the mound. When Heaton made his own trip, he resolved to get to the bottom of the mystery, and watchers from the village saw him hacking diligently at the shrubbery atop the mound. Then they saw his figure melt slowly into invisibility, not to reappear for long hours, till after the dusk grew on, and the torch of the headless squaw glimmered ghoulishly on the distant elevation. About 2 hours after nightfall, he staggered into the village minus his spade and other belongings, and burst into a shrieking monologue of disconnected ravings. He howled of shocking abysses and monsters, of terrifying carvings and statues, of human captors and grotesque tortures, and of other fantastic abnormalities too complex and chimerical to even remember. Old, 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 he would moan over and over again. Great God, they are older than the earth, and came here from somewhere else. They know what you think, and make you know what they think. They're half man, half ghost, cross the line, melt and take shape again, getting more and more so. Yet we're all descended from them in the beginning. Children of Tulu, everything made of gold, monstrous animals, half human, dead slaves, madness, I, Shub Nugaroth. That white man, oh my God, what they did to him. Heaton was the village idiot for about 8 years, after which he died in an epileptic fit. Since his ordeal, there had been 2 more cases of mound madness and 8 of total disappearances. Immediately after Heaton's mad return, 3 desperate and determined men had gone out to the lone hill, heavily armed and with spades and pickaxes. Watching villagers saw the Indian ghost melt away as the explorers drew near, and afterwards saw the men climb the mound and begin scouting around through the underbrush. All at once they faded into nothingness and were never seen again. One watcher with an especially powerful telescope thought he saw other forms dimly materialize beside the hapless men and drag them down into the mound, but this account remained uncorroborated. It is needless to say that no searching party went out after the lost ones, and that for many years the mound was wholly unvisited. Only when the incidents of 1981 were largely forgotten did anyone dare to think of further explorations. Then, about 1910, a fellow too young to recall the old horrors made a trip to the shunned spot and found nothing at all. Oh, Silver. It's a bad joke. By 1915, the acute dread and wild legendary of 91 had largely faded into the commonplace and unimaginative ghost tales at present surviving. That is, had so faded among the white people. On the nearby reservations were old Indians who thought much and kept their own counsel. About this time, a second wave of active curiosity and adventuring developed, and several bold searchers made the trip to the mound and returned. Then came a trip of 2 Eastern visitors with spades and other apparatus, a pair of amateur archaeologists connected with a small college who had been making studies among the Indians. No one watched this trip from the village, but they never came back. The search party went out after them, among them whom was my host, Clyde Compton. Found nothing whatsoever amiss at the mound. The next trip was the solitary venture of old Captain Lawton, a grizzled pioneer who had helped to open up the region in 1889, but who had never been there since. He recalled the mound and its fascination all through the years, and being now in comfortable retirement, resolved to have a try at solving the ancient riddle. Long familiarity with Indian myth had given him ideas rather stranger than those of the simple villagers, and he had made preparations for some extensive delving. As soon as you go into the kitchen and get them, Funny. Remember to bring enough for everybody. He ascended the mound on the morning of Thursday, May 11th, 1916. Watched through spyglasses by more than 20 people in the village and on the adjacent plain. His disappearance was very sudden and occurred as he was hacking at the shrubbery with a bush cutter. None could say more than he was there one moment and absent the next. For a week, no tidings of him reached Bingor, and then, in the middle of the night, there dragged itself into the village the object about which dispute still rages. It said it was, or had been, Captain Lawton, but was definitely younger, by as much as 40 years than the old man who had climbed the mound. Its hair was jet black, and its face, now distorted with nameless fright, free from wrinkles. But it did remind Grandma Compton most uncannily of the captain as he had looked back in '89. Its feet were cut off neatly at the ankles, and the stumps were smoothly healed to an extent almost incredible if the being really were the man who had walked upright a week before. It babbled of incomprehensible things and kept repeating the name George E. Lawton, as if trying to reassure itself of its own identity. The things it babbled of, Grandma Compton thought, were curiously like the hallucinations of poor young Heaton in '91. Though there were minor differences. The blue light, muttered the object, always down there, before there were any living things, older than the dinosaurs, always the same, only weaker, never death, brooding and brooding and brooding, same people, half man, half gas, the dead that walk and work. Oh, those beasts, those half-human unicorns, houses in cities of gold. Older than time, came down from the stars, great Tulu, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, waiting. The object died before dawn. Of course, there was an investigation, and the Indians at the reservations were grilled unmercifully. But they knew nothing and had nothing to say. At least none of them had anything to say except old Gray Eagle, a Wichita chieftain whose more than a century of age put him above common fears. He alone deigned to grunt some advice. Yay, congrats, Shags. You can thank Wookie Be Bad for that. Hush, Silver. You let 'em alone, white man. No good, those people. All under here, all under there. Them old ones. Yig, big father of snakes, he there. Yig is Yig. Tirawa, big father of men, he there. Tirawa is Tirawa. No die, no get old. Just same like air. Just live and wait. One time they come out here, live and fight. Build 'em dirt teepee. Bring up gold. They got plenty. Go off and make new lodges. Me them, you them. Then big waters come, all change. Nobody come out, let nobody in. Get in, no get out. You let 'em alone. You have no bad medicine. Red man no, he get no catch. White man meddle, he no come back. Little way, little hill. Keep way, little hills. No good. Gray Eagle say this. Hey, Rachel. If Joe Norton and Rance Wheelock had taken the old chief's advice, they would probably be here today, but they didn't. They were great readers and materialists and feared nothing in heaven or earth, and they thought that some Indian fiends had a secret headquarter inside the mound. They had been to the mound before, and now they went again to avenge old Captain Lawton, boasting that they'd do it if they had to tear the mound down altogether. Clyde Compton watched them with a pair of prism binoculars and saw them round the base of the sinister hill. Evidently, they meant to survey their territory very gradually and minutely. Minutes passed, and they did not reappear, nor were they ever seen again. Once more, the mound was a thing of panic fright, and only the excitement of the Great War seemed to restore it to the further background of Binger folklore. It was unvisited from 1916 to 1919, and would have remained so but for the daredeviltry of some youth back from service in France. From 1919 to 1920, however, there was a veritable epidemic of mound visiting among the prematurely hardened young veterans, an epidemic that waxed as one youth after another returned unhurt and contemptuous. By 1920, so short is human memory, the mound was almost a joke, and the tame story of the murdered squaw began to displace darker whispers on everybody's tongue. Then two reckless brothers, the especially unimaginative and hard-boiled Clay boys, decided to go and dig up the buried squaw and the gold for which the old Indian had murdered her. Nothing wrong with falling asleep, Metastep. They went out on a September afternoon, just about the time the Indian tom-toms began their incessant annual beating over the flat, red, dusty plains. Nobody watched them, and their parents did not become worried at their non-return for several hours. Then came an alarm and a searching party, and another resignation to the mystery of silence and doubt. But one of them came back after all. It was Ed, the elder, and his straw-colored hair and beard had turned an albino white for 2 inches from the roots. On his forehead was a queer scar like a branded hieroglyph. 3 months after he and his brother Walker had vanished, he skulked into his house at night, wearing nothing but a queerly patterned blanket, which he thrust into the fire as soon as he had gotten into a suit of his own clothes. He told his parents that he and Walker had been captured by some strange Indians, not Wichita or Caddos, and held prisoners somewhere towards the west. Walker had died under torture, but he himself had managed to escape at a high cost. The experience had been particularly terrible, and he could not talk about it just then. He must rest. And anyway, it would do no good to give an alarm and try to find and punish the Indians. They were not the sort that could be caught or punished, and it was especially important for the good of Binger, for the good of the world, that they be not pursued into their secret lair. As a matter of fact, they were not altogether what one could call real Indians. He would explain about that later. Meanwhile, he must rest. Better not to rouse the village with the news of his return. He would go upstairs and sleep. Before he climbed the rickety flight to his room, he took a pad and pencil from the living room table and an automatic pistol from his father's desk drawer. 3 hours later, the shot rang out. Ed Clay had put a bullet neatly through his temples with a pistol clutched in his left hand, leaving a sparsely written sheet of paper on the rickety table near his bed. He had, it appeared later from the whittled pencil stub and stove full of charred paper, originally written much more, but had finally decided not to tell what he knew beyond vague hints. The surviving fragment was only a mad warning scrawled in a curiously backhanded script, the raving of a mind obviously deranged by hardships, and it read thus, rather surprisingly for the utterance of one who had always been so stolid and matter-of-fact. For God's sakes, never go near that mound. It is part of some kind of world so devilish and old it cannot be spoke about. Me and Walker went and was took into the thing, just melted at times and made up again, and the whole world outside is helpless alongside what they can do. They what live forever as they like, and you can tell if they are really men or your ghosts. And what they do can't be spoke about, and it is only spoke about, and this is only one entrance. You can't tell how big the whole thing is. After what we've seen, I don't want to live anymore. France was nothing beside this, and see the people always keep away. Oh God, they would if they'd seen poor Walker like he was in the end. Yours truly, Ed Clay. At the autopsy, it was found that all of young Clay's organs were transposed from the right to left within his body, as if he had been turned inside out. Whether they had always been so, no one could say at times. But it was later learned from Army records that Ed had been perfectly normal when mustered out of the service in May 1919. Whether there was a mistake somewhere, or whether some unprecedented metamorphosis had indeed occurred, it is still an unsettled question, as is the origin of the hieroglyph-like scar on the forehead. That was the end of the explorations of the mound. In the 8 intervening years, no one had been near the place, and few indeed had even cared to level a spyglass at it. From time to time, people continued to glance nervously at the lone hill as it rose starkly from the plain against the western sky, and to shudder at the small dark speck that paraded by day and the glimmering will-o'-wisp that danced by night. The thing was accepted at face value as a mystery not to be probed, and by common consent the village shunned the subject. It was, after all, quite easy to avoid the hill, for space was unlimited in every direction, and community life always followed beaten trails. The mound sign of the village was simply kept trailless, as if it had been water or swampland or desert. And it's a curious commentary on the stolid and imaginative sterility of the human mind that whispers with which children and strangers were warned away from the mound quickly sank once more into the flat tale of murderous Indian ghosts and his squaw victim. Only the tribesmen on the reservation and thoughtful old-timers like Grandma Compton remember the overtones of unholy vistas and deep cosmic menace which clustered around the ravings of those who had come back changed and shattered. It was very late, and Grandma Compton had long since gone upstairs to bed, when Clyde finished telling me this. I already knew what to think of the frightful puzzle, yet rebelled at any notion to conflict with sane materialism. What influence had brought madness or the impulse of flight and wandering to so many who had visited the mound? Though vastly impressed, I was spurred on rather than deterred. Surely, I must get to the bottom of this matter, as well I might if I kept a cool head and an unbroken determination. Compton saw my mood and shook his head worriedly. Then he motioned me to follow him outdoors. We stepped from the frame house to the quiet side of the street or lane, and walked a few paces in the light of a waning August moon to where the houses were thinner. The half moon was still low, and had not blotted many stars from the sky, so that I could see not only the westering gleams of Altair and Vega, but the mystic shimmering of the Milky Way, as I look out over the vast expanse of earth and sky in the direction that Compton pointed. Then all at once I saw a spark that was not a star, a bluish spark that moved and glimmered against the Milky Way near the horizon, and that seemed in a vague way more evil and malevolent than anything in the vault above. In another moment it was clear that the spark came from the top of a long distant rise in the outspread and faintly lit plain. And I turned to Compton with a question. "Yes," he answered. "It's the blue ghost light, and that is the Mound. There's not a night in history that we haven't seen it, and not a living soul in Bigger that would walk out over the plain towards it. It's bad business, young man, and if you're wise, you'll let it rest where it is. Better call off your search, son, and tackle some other Injun legends around here. We've got plenty to keep you busy, heaven knows." But I was in no mood for advice, and though Compton gave me a pleasant room, I could not sleep a wink through eagerness for the next morning and its chances to see the daytime ghost and to question the Indians at the reservation. I meant to go about the whole thing slowly and thoroughly, equipping myself with all available data, both white and red, before I commenced any actual archaeological investigations. I rose and dressed at dawn, and when I heard others stirring, I went downstairs. Compton was building the kitchen fire while his mother was busy in the pantry. When he saw me, he nodded, and after a moment invited me out to the glamorous young sunlight. I knew where we were going, and as we walked along the lane, I strained my eyes westward over the plains. There was the Mound, far away and very curious in its aspect of artificial regularity. It must have been from 30 to 40 feet high, and all of 100 yards from north to south as I looked at it. It was not as wide as that from east to west, Compton said, but had the contours of a rather thinnish ellipse. He, I knew, had been safely out to it and back several times. As I looked at the rim silhouetted against the blue sky of the west, I tried to follow its minor irregularities, and became impressed with a sense of something moving upon it. My pulse mounted a bit feverishly, and I seized quickly on the high-power binoculars which Compton had quietly offered me. Focusing them hastily, I saw at first only a tangle of underbrush on the distant mound's rim, and then something stalked into the field. It was unmistakably a human shape, and I knew at once I was seeing the daytime Indian ghost. I did not wonder at the description, for surely the tall, lean, darkly robed being with the filleted black hair and seamed coppery expressionless aquiline face looked more like an Indian than anything else in my previous experience. And yet my trained ethnologist's eye told me at once that this was no redskin of any sort hitherto known to history, but a creature of a vast racial variation and a wholly different culture stream. Modern Indians are brachiocephalic, round-headed, and you can't find any... I actually looked up this word last night to pronounce it, but now I'm having problems with it again. Okay, hold on. Hey, McCracken, how you doing? And you can't find any dolichocephalic or long-headed skulls except in ancient Pueblo deposits dating back 2,500 years or more. Yet this man's long-headedness was so pronounced that I recognized it at once, even at his vast distance and in the uncertain field of the binoculars. I saw, too, that the pattern of his robe represented a decorative tradition utterly remote from anything we recognize in southwestern native art. There were shining metal trappings, likewise, and a short sword or kindred weapon at his side, all wrought in a fashion wholly alien to anything I have ever heard of. As he paced back and forth along the top of the mound, I followed him for several minutes with the glass, noting the kinesthetic quality of his stride and the poised way he carried his head. And there was borne upon me the strong, persistent conviction that this man, whoever or whatever he might be, was certainly not a savage. He was the product of a civilization. I felt instinctively, though of what civilization I could not guess. At length he disappeared beyond the farther edge of the mound, as if descending the opposite and unseen slope. I lowered the glass with a curious mixture of puzzled feelings. Compton was looking quizzically at me, and I nodded noncommittally. "What do you make of that?" he ventured. "This is what we've seen here in Bangor every day of our lives." That noon found me at the Indian reservation, talking with old Gray Eagle, who, through some miracle, was still alive, though he must have been close to 150 years old. He was a strange, impressive figure, this stern, fearless leader of his kind, who had talked with outlaws and traitors in fringed black buckskin and French officers in knee breeches and three-cornered hats. And I was glad to see that, because of my air of deference towards him, he appeared to like me. His liking, however, took an unfortunately obstructive form as soon as he learned what I wanted, for all he would do was warn me against the search I was about to make. "You good boy. You no bother that hill. Bad medicine. Plenty devil under there. Catch 'em when you dig. No dig, no hurt. Go dig, no come back. Just same when me boy. Just same when my father and he father boy. All time buck he walk in day. Squaw with no head she walk in night. All time since white man with tin coats they come from sunset and below Big River. Long way back, 3-4 times more back than Gray Eagle, 2 times more back than Frenchmen, all same after then. More back than that, nobody go near little hills nor deep valleys with stone caves. Still more back, those old ones no hide, come out and make villages, bring plenty gold, me them, you them. Then big waters come, all change. Nobody come out, let nobody in. Get in, no get out. They no die. No get old like Gray Eagle with valleys in face and snow on head. Same just like air. Some man, some spirit. Bad medicine. Sometimes at night spirit come out on half moon, half horse with horn and fight where men once fight. Keep way them place. No good. You good boy. Go way. Let them old ones lone." That was all I could get out of the ancient chief, and the rest of the Indians would say nothing at all. But if I was troubled, Gray Eagle clearly more so, for he obviously felt a real regret at the thought of my invading the region he feared so abjectly. As I turned to leave the reservation, he stopped me for a final ceremonial farewell, and once more tried to get my promise to abandon my search. When he saw that he could not, he produced something half timidly from a buckskin pouch he wore, and extended it towards me very solemnly. It was a worn but finely minted metal disc, about 2 inches in diameter, oddly figured and perforated, and suspended from a leathern cord. Hold on, I gotta adjust something. Okay. You no promise, then Gray Eagle can no tell what get you. But if anything help 'em, this good medicine. Come from my father, he get from he father, all the way back, close to Tiarawa, all men's father. My father say, you keep way from those old ones, keep way from little hills and valleys with stone caves. But if old ones, they come out to get you, you shew 'em this medicine. They know. They make him long way back. They look, then they no do such bad medicine maybe, but no can tell. You keep way just same. Them no good, no tell what they do. As he spoke, Great Eagle was hanging the thing around my neck, and I saw it was a very curious object indeed. The more I looked at it, the more I marveled, for not only was its heavy, darkish, lustrous, and richly modeled substance an absolute strange metal to me, but what was left of its design seemed to be of marvelously artistic and utterly unknown workmanship. One side, so far as I could see, had borne an exquisite modeled serpent design, whilst the other side had depicted a kind of octopus or other tentacled monster. There was some half-effaced hieroglyphics, too, of a kind which no archaeologist could identify or even place conjecturally. With Grey Eagle's permission, I later had expert historians, anthropologists, geologists, and chemists pass carefully upon the disk, but from them I obtained only a chorus of bafflement. It defied either classification or analysis. The chemists called it an amalgam of unknown metallic elements of heavy atomic weight, and one geologist suggested that the substance must be of meteoric origin, shot from unknown gulfs of interstellar space. Whether it really saved my life or sanity or existence as a human being, I cannot attempt to say, but Grey Eagle is sure of it. He has it again now, and I wonder if it has any connection with his inordinate age. All his fathers who had lived far beyond the century mark, perishing only in battle. Is it possible that Grey Eagle, if kept from accidents, will never die? But I'm ahead of the story. When I returned to the village, I tried to secure more Mound lore, but found only excited gossip and opposition. It was really flattering to see how solicitous the people were about my safety, but I had to set their almost frantic remonstrations aside. I shewed them Grey Eagle's charm, but none of them had ever heard of it before, or had seen anything remotely like it. They agreed that it could not be an Indian relic, and imagined that the old chief's ancestors must have attained it from some trader. When they saw they could not deter me from my trip, the Binger citizens sadly did what they could to aid my outfitting. Having known before my arrival the sort of work to be done, I had most of my supplies already with me, machete and trench knife for shrub clearing and excavating, electric torches for any underground phase which might develop, rope, field glasses, tape measure, microscope, and incidentals for emergencies, as much, in fact, as might be comfortably stowed in a convenient handbag. To this equipment I added only the heavy revolver which the sheriff forced upon me, and the pick and shovel which I thought might expedite my work. I decided to carry these latter things slung over my shoulder with a stout cord, for I soon saw that I could not hope for any helpers or fellow explorers. The village would watch me, no doubt, with all its available telescopes and field glasses, but it would not send any citizens so much a yard over the flat plain towards the lone hillock. My start was timed for early the next morning, and all the rest of that day I was treated with the awed and uneasy respect which people give to a man about to set out for certain doom. When morning came, a cloudy, though not threatening morning, the whole village turned out to see me start across the dust-blown plain. Binoculars shewed the lone man at his usual pacing on the mound, and I resolved to keep him in sight as steadily as possible during my approach. At the last moment, a vague sense of dread oppressed me, and I was just weak and whimsical enough to let Grey Eagle's talisman swing on my chest in full view of any being or ghosts who might be inclined to heed it. Bidding au revoir to Compton and his mother, I started off at a brisk pace despite the bag in my left hand and the clanking pick and shovel strapped to my back, holding my field glasses in my right hand and taking a glance at the silent pacer from time to time. As I neared the mound, I saw the man very clearly and fancied I could trace an expression of infinite evil and decadence on his seamed, hairless features. I was startled, too, to see that his goldenly gleaming weapon case bore hieroglyphics very similar to those on the unknown talisman I wore. All the creature's costume and trappings bespoke exquisite workmanship and cultivation. Then, all too abruptly, I saw him start down the farther side of the mound and out of sight. When I reached the place, about 10 minutes after I set out, there was no one there. There is no need of relating how I spent the early part of my searching and surveying and circumnavigating the mound, taking measurements and stepping back to view the thing from different angles. It had impressed me tremendously as I approached it, and there seemed to be a kind of latent menace in its two regular outlines. It was the only elevation of any sort on the wide, level plain, and I could not doubt for a moment that it was an artificial tumulus. The steep sides seemed wholly unbroken, and without marks of human tenancy or passage. There was no sign of a path towards the top, and, burdened as I was, I managed to scramble up only with considerable difficulty. When I reached the summit, I found a roughly level elliptical plateau, about 300 by 50 feet in dimensions, uniformly covered with rank grass and dense underbrush, and utterly incompatible with the constant presence of a pacing sentinel. This condition gave me a real shock, for it shewed beyond the question that the old Indian, vivid though he seemed, could not be other than a collective hallucination. I looked about with considerable perplexity and alarm, glancing wistfully back at the villagers and the mass of black dots which I knew was the watching crowd. Training my glass upon them, I saw that they were studying me avidly with their glasses, so to reassure them, I waved my cap in the air with a show of jauntiness which I was far from feeling. Then, settling to my work, I flung down pick, shovel, and bag, taking my machete from the ladder and commencing to clear away underbrush. It was a weary task, and now and then I felt a curious shiver as some perverse gust of wind arose to hamper my motion with a skill approaching deliberateness. At times it seemed as if a half-tangible force were pushing me back as I worked, almost as if the air thickened in front of me, or as if a formless hand tugged at my wrists. My energy seemed used up without producing adequate results, yet for all of that I made some progress. By afternoon, I clearly perceived that, towards the northern end of the mound, there was a slight bowl-like depression in the root-entangled earth. While this might mean nothing, it would be a good place to begin when I reached the digging stage. And I made a mental note of it. At the same time, I noticed another very peculiar thing, namely, that the Indian talisman swinging from my neck seemed to behave oddly at a point about 17 feet southeast of the suggested bowl. The gyrations were altered whenever I happened to stoop around that point, and it tugged downwards as if attracted by some magnetism in the soil. The more I noticed this, the more it struck me, till at length I decided to do a little preliminary digging there without further delay. As I turned up the soil with my trench knife, I could not help wondering at the relative thinness of the reddish regional layer. The country as a whole was all red sandstone earth, but here I found a strange black loam less than a foot down. It was such soil as one finds in the strange deep valleys further west and south, and must surely have been brought from a considerable distance in the prehistoric age when the mound was reared. Kneeling and digging, I felt the leather cord around my neck tugged harder and harder, as something in the soil seemed to draw the heavy metal talisman more and more. Then I felt my implement strike a hard surface, and wondering if a rock layer rested beneath. Prying about with the trench knife, I found that such was not the case. Instead, to my intense surprise and feverish interest, I brought up a mold-clogged heavy object of cylindrical shape, about a foot long and 4 inches in diameter, to which my hanging talisman clove with glue-like tenacity. As I cleared off the black loam, my wonder and tension increased at the bas-relief revealed by that process. The whole cylinder, ends and all, was covered with figures and hieroglyphs, and I saw with growing excitement that these things were in the same unknown tradition as those on Grey Eagle's charm, and on the yellow metal trappings of the ghost I had seen through my binoculars. Sitting down, I further cleaned the magnetic cylinder against the rough corduroy of my knickerbockers. Vincent, I'm reading. Stop stealing the mic. Silly cat. Okay. Where was I? Sitting down, I further cleaned the magnetic cylinder against the rough corduroy of my knickerbockers, and observed that it was made of the same heavy, lustrous, unknown metal as the charm. Hence, no doubt, the singular attraction. The carvings and chasings were very strange and very horrible. Nameless monsters and designs fraught with insidious evil. All were of the highest finish of craftsmanship. I could not at first make head or tail of things, and handled it aimlessly until I spied a cleavage near one end. Then I sought eagerly for some mode of opening, discovering at last that it's the end simply unscrewed. The cap yielded with difficulty, but at last came off, liberating a curious aromatic odor. The sole contents was a bulky roll of yellowish paper-like substance, inscribed in greenish characters, and for a second I had the supreme thrill of fancying that I held a written key to unknown elder worlds and abysses beyond time. Almost immediately, however, the unrolling of one end shewed that the manuscript was in Spanish, albeit the formal, pompous Spanish of a long-departed day. In the golden sunset light I looked at the heading and the opening paragraph, trying to decipher the wretched and ill-punctuated script of the vanished writer. What manner of relic was this? Upon what sort of discovery had I stumbled? The first words set me in a new fury of excitement and curiosity, for instead of diverting me from my original quest, they startlingly confirmed me in that very effort. The yellow scroll with the greenish script began with a bold, identifying caption and a ceremoniously desperate appeal for belief in incredible revelations to follow. Okay, this is the terrible Spanish for the record. Relación de Panfilio de Zamacón y Núñez Hidalgo de Lorca en Asturias, tocante al mundo subterráneo de Chianian AD MDXLV. El nombre de la Santísima Trinidad, Padre, Hijo y Espíritu Santo, tres personas distantes y un solo. Dios verdadero y la Santísima Virgen Nuestra Señora, yo Panfilio de Zamacón, hijo de Pedro Guzmán y Zamacón, Hidalgo y de la dona Inés Alvarado y Núñez de Lorca en Asturias, Yaro para que todo que deco esta verdadera como sacramento. To any of my Spanish speakers, I apologize. I paused to reflect on the portentous significance of what I was reading. The narrative of Panfilo de Zamacona y Núñez, gentleman of La Cura in Asturias, concerning the subterranean world of Cianian, A.D. 1545. Here, surely, was too much for my mind to absorb all at once. A subterranean world, again that persistent idea which filtered through all the Indian tales, and through all the utterances of those who had come back from the Mound. And the date, 1545. What could this mean? In 1540, Coronado and his men had gone north from Mexico into the wilderness, but had they not turned back in 1542? My eye ran questioningly down the open part of the scroll, and almost at once seized on the name Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. The writer of this thing, clearly, was one of Coronado's men. But what had he been doing in this remote realm 3 years after his party had gone back? I must read further, for another glance told me that what was now unrolled was merely a summary of Coronado's northward march, differing in no essential way from the account known to history. It was only the waning light which checked me before I could unroll and read more, and in my impatient bafflement I almost forgot to be frightened at the onrush of night in this sinister place. Others, however, had not forgotten the lurking terror, for I heard a loud, distant hallooing from a knot of men who had gathered at the edge of town. Answering the anxious hail, I restored the manuscript to its strange cylinder, to which the disc around my neck still clung, until I pried it off and packed it and my smaller implements for departure. Leaving the pick and shovel for the next day's work, I took up my handbag, scrambled down the steep side of the mound, and in another quarter hour was back in the village explaining and exhibiting my curious find. As darkness drew on, I glanced back at the mound I had so lately left, and saw with a shudder that the faint bluish torch of the nocturnal squaw ghost had begun to glimmer. Well, Sleazy, I'm probably one of the whitest women in existence. You shouldn't be surprised. About the only thing not white about me is my ass. One moment. And voice. I have to take your word on that one, Avery. It was hard work waiting to get at the bygone Spaniard's narrative, but I knew I must have quiet and leisure for a good translation, so reluctantly saved the task for the later hours of the night. Promising the townsfolk a clear account of my findings in the morning, and giving them an ample opportunity to examine the bizarre and provocative cylinder, I accompanied Clyde Compton home and ascended to my room for the translating process as soon as I possibly could. My host and his mother were intently eager to hear the tale, but I thought they had better wait until I could thoroughly absorb the text myself and give them the gist concisely and unerringly. Opening my handbag in the light of a single electric bulb, I took out the cylinder and noted the instant magnetism which pulled the Indian talisman to its carven surface. Wow. The designs glimmered evilly on the rich, lustrous, and unknown metal, and I could not help shivering as I studied the abnormal and blasphemous forms that leered at me with such exquisite workmanship. I wish now that I had carefully photographed all these designs, though perhaps it is just as well that I did not. One thing I am really glad, that is that I could not then identify the squatting octopus-headed thing which had recently dominated most of the ornate cartouches, and which the manuscript called Tulu. Recently, I have associated it, and the legends in the manuscript connected with it, with some newfound folklore of monstrous and unmentioned Cthulhu, a horror which seeped down from the stars while the young earth was still half formed. And had I known of the connection then, I could not have stayed in the same room with the thing. A secondary motif, a semi-anthropomorphic serpent, I did quite readily place as a prototype of the Yig, Quetzalcoatl, and Kukulkan conceptions. Before opening the cylinder, I tested its magnetic powers on metals other than that of Grey Eagle's disc, but found that no attraction existed. It was no common magnetism which pervaded this morbid fragment of unknown worlds and linked it to its kind. At last I took out the manuscript and began translating, jotting down a synoptic outline in English as I went, and now and then regretting the absence of a Spanish dictionary when I came upon some especially obscure or archaic word or construction. There was a sense of ineffable strangeness in thus being thrown back nearly 4 centuries in the midst of my continuous quest, thrown back to a year when my own forebears were settled, home-keeping gentlemen of Somerset and Devon under Henry VIII, with never a thought of the adventure that was to take their blood to Virginia in the New World. Yet, when that New World possessed, even as now, the same brooding mystery of the Mound, which formed my present sphere and horizon. The sense of a throwback was all the stronger because I felt instinctively that the common problem of the Spaniard and myself was one of such abysmal timeliness, of such unholy and unearthly eternity, that the scant 400 years between us bulked us nothing in comparison. It took no more than a single look at that monstrous and insidious cylinder to make me realize the dizzying gulfs that yawned between men of the known earth and the primal mysteries it represented. Before that gulf, Pamphilo di Zamacona and I stood side by side, just as Aristotle and I, or Chepos and I, might have stood. Of his youth in Luarca, a small placid port on the Bay of Biscay, Zamacona told little. He had been wild and a younger son, and had come to New Spain in 1532, when only 20 years old. Sensitively imaginative, he had listened spellbound to the floating rumors of rich cities and unknown worlds to the north, and especially to the tale of the Franciscan friar Marcos de Niza, who came back from a trip in 1539 with glowing accounts of fabulous Cibola and its great walled towns with terraced stone houses. Hearing of Coronado's contemplated expedition in search of these wonders, and of greater wonders whispered to lie beyond them in the land of Buffalo, young Zamacona managed to join the party of 300 and started north with the rest in 1540. History knows the story of that expedition, how Cibola was found to be merely the squalid Pueblo village of Zuni, and how Deniza was sent back to Mexico in disgrace for his florid exaggerations. How Coronado first saw the Grand Canyon, and how at Sicuye on the Pecos he heard from the Indians called El Turco of the rich and mysterious land of Quivira, far to the northeast, where gold, silver, and buffaloes abounded, and where flowed a river 2 leagues wide. Zamacona told briefly of the winter camp at Tiguex on the Pecos, and of the northward start in April, when the native guide proved false and led the party astray amidst a land of prairie dogs, salt pools, and roving bison-hunting tribes. When Coronado dismissed his larger force and made his final 42-day march with a very small and select detachment, Zamacona managed to be included in the advancing party. He spoke of the fertile country and of the great ravines with trees visible only from the edges of their steep banks, and of how all the men lived solely on buffalo meat. And then came mention of the expedition's farthest limit, of the presumable but disappointing land of Quivira, with its villages of grass houses, its brooks and rivers, its good black soil, its plums, nuts, grapes, and mulberries, and its maize growing and copper-using Indians. The execution of El Turco, the false native guide, was casually touched upon, and there was a mention of the cross which Coronado raised on the bank of a great river in the autumn of 1541, a cross bearing the inscription, "Thus far came the great general Francisco Vasquez de Coronado." This supposed Quivira lay at the 40th parallel of north latitude. And I see that quite lately the New York archaeologist Dr. Hodge had identified it with the course of the Arkansas River through Barton and Rice counties in Kansas. It is the old home of the Wichitas before the Sioux drove them south into what is now Oklahoma, and some of the grass house village sites have been found and excavated for artifacts. Coronado did considerable exploring hereabouts, led thither and hither by persistent rumors of rich cities and hidden worlds which floated fearfully around on the Indians' tongues. These northerly natives seemed more afraid and reluctant to talk about the rumored cities and worlds than the Mexican Indians had been, yet at the same time seemed as if they could reveal a good deal more than the Mexicans had been willing or dared to do so. Excuse me. Their vagueness exasperated the Spanish leader, and after many disappointing searches, he began to be very severe towards those who brought him stories. Zamacona, more patient than Coronado, found the tales especially interesting, and learned enough of local speech to hold long conversations with a young buck named Charging Buffalo, whose curiosity had led him into much stranger places than any of his fellow tribesmen had dared to penetrate. All right. It was Charging Buffalo who told Zamacona of the queer stone doorways, gates, or cave mouths at the bottom of some of those deep, steep, wooded ravines which the party had noticed on their northward march. These openings, he said, were mostly concealed by shrubbery, and few had entered them for untold eons. Those who went to where they led never returned, or in a few cases returned mad or curiously maimed. But all this was legend, for nobody was known to have gone more than a limited distance inside any of them, within the memory of the grandfathers of the oldest living men. Charging Buffalo himself had probably been farther than anyone else, and he had seen enough to curb both his curiosity and his greed for the rumored gold below. Beyond the aperture he had entered there was a long passageway running crazily up and down, round and round about, and covered with frightful carvings of monsters and horrors that no man should have ever seen. At last, after untold miles of winding and descents, there was a glow of terrible blue light, and the passage opened upon a shocking netherworld. About this, the Indian would say no more, for he had seen something that had sent him back in haste. But the golden cities must be somewhere down there, he added, and perhaps a white man with the magic of the thunderstick might succeed in getting to them. He would not tell the big chief Coronado what he knew, for Coronado would not listen to Indian talk anymore. Yes, he could show Zamacona the way if the white man would leave the party and accept his guidance, but he would not go inside the opening with the white man. It was bad in there. The place was about a 5 days' march to the south, near the region of great mounds. These mounds had something to do with the evil world down there. They were probably ancient closed-up passages to it. For once the old ones below had colonies on the surface and traded with men everywhere, even in the lands that had sunk under the big waters. It was when those lands had sunk that the old ones closed themselves up below and refused to deal with surface people. The refugees from the sinking places had told them that the gods of outer earth were against men, and that no men could survive on the outer earth unless they were demons in league with the evil gods. And this is why they shut out all surface folk, and did fearful things to any who ventured down where they dwelt. There had been sentries once at the various openings, but after ages they were no longer needed. Not many people cared to talk about the hidden old ones, and the legends about them would probably have died out but for certain ghostly reminders of their presence now and then. It seemed that the infinite ancientness of these creatures had brought them strangely near to the borderline of spirit, so that their ghostly emanations were more commonly frequent and vivid. According to the region of the great mounds was often convulsed with spectral nocturnal battles reflecting those which had been fought in the days before the openings were closed. The old ones themselves were half ghosts. Indeed, it was said that they no longer grew old or reproduced their kind, but flickered eternally in a state between flesh and spirit. Their change was not complete, though, for they had to breathe. It was because the underground world needed air that the openings in the deep valleys were not blocked up as the mound openings on the plains had been. These openings, Charging Buffalo added, were probably based on natural fissures in the earth. It was whispered that the old ones had come down from the stars to the world when it was very young, and had gone inside to build their cities of solid gold, because the surface was not then fit to live on. They were the ancestors of all men, yet none could guess from what star or what place beyond the stars they came. Their hidden cities were full of gold and silver, but men had better let them alone unless protected by very strong magic. They had frightful beasts with a faint strain of human blood on which they rode and which they employed for other purposes. The things, so people hinted, were carnivorous and, like their masters, preferred human flesh. So although the old ones themselves did not breed, they had a sort of half-human slave class, which also served to nourish the human and animal population. They had been very oddly recruited and was supplemented by a second slave class of reanimated corpses. The old ones know how to make a corpse into an automaton, which would last almost indefinitely and perform any sort of work when directed by streams of thought. Chasing Buffalo said that the people had come to talk by means of thought only, speech having been found crude and needless, except for religious devotion and emotional expressions, as aeons of discovery and study rolled by. They worshipped Yig, the great father of serpents, and Tulu, the octopus-headed entity that had brought them down from the stars, appeasing both of these hideous monstrosities by means of human sacrifices offered up in a very curious manner, which Charging Buffalo did not care to describe. Zamakono was held spellbound by the Indian's tale, and at once resolved to accept his guidance to the cryptic doorway in the ravine. He did not believe the accounts of strange ways attributed by legend to the hidden people, for the experiences of the party had been as such as to disillusion one regarding native myths of unknown lands. But he did feel that some sufficiently marvelous fields of riches and adventure must indeed lie beyond the weirdly carved passages in the earth. At first he thought of persuading Charging Buffalo to tell his story to Coronado, offering to shield him against any effects of the leader's testy skepticism. But later he decided that a lone adventurer would be better. If he had no aid, he would not have to share anything he found, but might perhaps become a great discoverer and owner of fabulous Riches. Success would make him a greater figure than Coronado himself, perhaps a greater figure than anyone else in New Spain, including the mighty Viceroy Don Antonio de Mendoza. On October 7th, 1541, at an hour close to midnight, Zamacona stole out of the Spanish camp near the Grass House village and met Charging Buffalo for the long southward journey. He traveled as lightly as possible and did not wear his heavy helmet and breastplate. Of the details of the trip, the manuscript told little, but Zamacona recorded his arrival at the Great Ravine on October 13th. The descent of the thickly wooded slope took no great time, though the Indian had trouble in locating the shrubbery-hidden stone door again amidst the twilight of that deep gorge. The place was finally found, and it was a very small aperture as doorways go, formed of monolithic sandstone jambs and lintel, bearing sign of nearly effaced and now undecipherable carvings. Its height was perhaps 7 feet, and its width not more than 4. There were drilled places in the jambs which argued the bygone presence of a hinged door or gate, but all other traces of such things had long since vanished. At the sight of this black gulf, Charging Buffalo displayed considerable fear and threw down his pack of supplies with a sign of haste. He provided Zamacona with a good stock of resinous torches and provisions, and had guided him honestly and well, but refused to share in the venture that lay ahead. Zamacona gave him the trinkets he had kept for such an occasion, and obtained his promise to return to the region in a month, afterwards shewing the way southward to the Pecos Pueblo villages. A prominent rock on the plain above them was chosen as a meeting place, the one arriving first to pitch camp until the other one should arrive. In the manuscript, Zamacona expressed a wistful wonder as to the Indian's length of waiting at the rendezvous, for he himself could never keep that tryst. At the last moment, Charging Buffalo tried to dissuade him from his plunge into the darkness, but soon saw it was futile, and gestured a stoic farewell. Before lighting his first torch and entering the opening with his ponderous pack, the Spaniard watched the lean form of the Indian scrambling hastily and rather relievedly upward among the trees. It was the cutting of his last link with the world, though he did not know that he was to never see a human being, in the accepted sense of that term, again. Zamacona felt no immediate premonition of evil upon entering the ominous doorway, though from the first he was surrounded by a bizarre and unwholesome atmosphere. The passage, slightly taller and wider than the aperture, was for many yards a level tunnel of cyclopean masonry, with heavy worn flagstones underfoot and grotesquely carved granite and sandstone blocks in sides and ceilings. The carvings must have been loathsome and terrible indeed, to judge from Zamacona's description, according to which most of them revolved around the monstrous beings Yig and Tulu. They were unlike anything the adventurer had ever seen before, though he added that the native architecture of Mexico came closest to them of all things in the outer world. After some distance, the tunnel began to dip abruptly, and irregular natural rock appeared on all sides. The passage seemed only partly artificial, and decorations were limited to occasional cartouches with shocking bas-reliefs. Following an enormous descent, whose steepness at the time produced an acute danger of slipping and tobogganing, the passage became exceedingly uncertain in its direction and variable in its contour. At times it narrowed almost to a slit, or grew so low that stooping and even crawling were necessary, while at other times it broadened out into sizable caves or chains of caves. Very little human construction, it was plain, had gone into this part of the tunnel, though occasionally a sinister cartouche or hieroglyphic on the wall, or a blocked-up lateral passage, would remind Zamacona that this was in truth the aeon-forgotten high road to a primal and unbelievable world of living things. For 3 days, as best he could reckon, Pamphilio de Zamacona scrambled down, up, along, and around, but always predominantly downward, through this dark region of Paleogean. Once in a while he heard some secret being of darkness patter or flap out of his way, and on just one occasion he half glimpsed a great bleached thing that sent him trembling. The quality of the air was mostly very tolerable, though fetid zones were now and then met with, while one great cavern of stalactites and stalagmites afforded a depressing dampness. This latter, when Charging Buffalo had come upon it, had quite seriously barred the way, since the limestone deposits of age had built fresh pillars in the path of the primordial abyss desnants. The Indian, however, had broken through these, so that Zamacona did not find his course impeded. It was an unconscious effort or comfort to him to reflect that somebody else from the outside world had been there before, and the Indian's careful description had removed the element of surprise and unexpectedness. More, Charging Buffalo's knowledge of the tunnel had led him to provide so good a torch supply for the journey in and out that there would be no danger of becoming stranded in darkness. Zamacona camped twice, building a fire whose smoke seemed well taken care of by the natural ventilation. At what he considered the end of the third day, though his cocksure guesswork chronology is not at any time to be given the easy faith that he gave it, Zamacona encountered the prodigious descent and subsequent prodigious climb which Charging Buffalo had described as the tunnel's last phase. At certain earlier points, marks of artificial improvement were here discernible, and several times the steep gradient was eased by a flight of rough-hewn steps. The torch shewed more and more of the monstrous carvings on the walls, and finally the resinous flare seemed mixed with a fainter and more diffusive light as Zamacona climbed up and up after the last downward stairway. At length the ascent ceased, and a level passage of artificial masonry with dark basaltic blocks led straight ahead. There was no need for a torch now, and the air was glowing with a bluish quasi-electric radiance that flickered like an aurora. It was the strange light of the inner world that the Indian had described, and in another moment Zamacona emerged from the tunnel upon a bleak, rocky hillside which climbed above him to a seething, impenetrable sky of bluish coruscations and descended dizzily below him to an apparently illimitable plain shrouded in bluish mist. He had come to the unknown world at last, and from his manuscript it is clear that he viewed the formless landscape as proudly and exaltedly as ever his fellow countryman Balboa viewed the new-found Pacific from that unforgetting peak in Darien. Hey, mofo Q. Charging Buffalo had turned back at this point, driven by fear of something which he would only describe vaguely and evasively as a herd of bad cattle, neither horse nor buffalo, but like the thing the mounted spirits rode at night. But Zamacona could not be deterred by any such trifle. Instead of fear, a strange sense of glory filled him, for he had imagination enough to know what it meant to stand alone in an inexplicable netherworld whose existence no other white man suspected. The soil of the great hill that surged upward behind him and spread steeply downward below him was dark gray, rock-strewn, without vegetation, and probably basaltic in origin, with an unearthly cast which made him feel like an intruder on an alien planet. The vast distant plain, thousands of feet below, had no features he could distinguish, especially since it appeared to be largely veiled in curling, bluish vapor. But more than hill or plain or cloud, the bluely luminous, coruscating sky impressed the adventurer with a sense of supreme wonder and mystery. What created the sky within a world he could not tell, though he knew of the northern lights and even had seen them once or twice. He concluded that this subterraneous light was something vaguely akin to the aurora, a view which moderns may well endorse, though it seems likely that certain phenomena of radioactivity may also enter in. At Zamacona's back, the mouth of the tunnel he had traversed yawned darkly, defined by a stone doorway very like the one he had entered the world above, save that it was of grayish-black basalt instead of red sandstone. There were hideous sculptures still in good preservation and perhaps corresponding to those on the outer portal, which time had largely weathered away. The absence of weathering here argued a dry, temperate climate indeed. The Spaniard already began to note the delightful spring-like stability of the temperature which marks the air of the North's interior. On the stone jambs were works proclaiming the bygone presence of hinges, but of any actual door or gate no traces remained. Seating himself for rest and thought, Zamacona lighted his pack by removing an amount of food and torches sufficient to take him back through the tunnel. These he proceeded to cache at the opening, under a cairn hastily formed of the rock fragments which everywhere lay around. Then, readjusting his lightened pack, he commenced his ascent towards the distant plain, preparing to invade a region which no living thing of outer earth had penetrated in a century or more, which no white man had ever penetrated, and from which, if legend were to be believed, no organic creature had ever returned sane. Zamacona strode briskly along down the steep, interminable slope, his progress checked at times by the bad walking that came from loose rock fragments, or by the excessive precipitousness of the grade. The distance of the mist-shrouded plain must have been enormous, for many hours' walking brought him apparently no closer to it than he had been before. Behind him was always the great hill stretching upward into a bright aerial sea of bluish coruscations. Silence was universal, so that his own footsteps and the fall of stones that he dislodged stuck on his ears with startling distinctness. It was at what he regarded as about noon that he first saw the abnormal footprints which set him to thinking of charging buffalo's terrible hints, precipitate flight, and strangely abiding terror. The rock-strewn nature of the soil gave him few opportunities for tracks of any kind, but at one point, a rather level interval had caused the loose detritus to accumulate in a ridge, leaving a considerable area of dark gray loam absolutely bare. Here, in a rambling confusion indicating a large herd's aimless wandering, Zamacona found the abnormal prints. It is to be regretted that he could not describe them more exactly, but the manuscript displayed far more vague fear than accurate observation. Just what it was that so frightened the Spaniard could only be inferred from his later hints regarding the beasts. He referred to the prints as not hooves, nor hands, nor feet, nor precisely paws, nor so large as to cause alarm on that account. Just why or how long ago things had been there was not easy to guess. There was no vegetation visible, hence grazing was out of the question. But of course, if the beasts were carnivorous, they might well be hunting smaller animals, whose tracks their own would tend to obliterate. Glancing backwards from the plateau to the heights above, Zamacona thought he detected traces of a great winding road which had once led from the tunnel downward to the plain. One could get the impression of this former highway only from a broad panoramic view, since a trickle of loose rock fragments had long ago obscured it. but the adventurer felt none the less certain that it had existed. It had not, probably, been an elaborate paved trunk route, for the small tunnel it reached seemed scarcely like a main avenue to the outer world. In choosing a straight path of descent, Zamacona had not followed its curving course, though he must have crossed it once or twice. With his attention now called to it, he looked ahead to see if he could trace it downward toward the plain, and this he finally thought he could do. He resolved to investigate its surface when next he crossed it, and perhaps to pursue its line for the rest of the way if he could distinguish it. Having resumed his journey, Zamacona came some time later upon what he thought was a bend of the ancient road. There were signs of grading and of some primal attempt at rock surfacing, but not enough was left to make the route worth following. While rummaging about in the soil with his sword, the Spaniard turned up something that glittered in the eternal blue daylight, and was thrilled at beholding a kind of coin or medal of a dark, unknown, lustrous metal with hideous designs on each side. It was utterly baffling and alien to him, and from its description I have no doubt that it was a duplicate of the talisman given me by Grey Eagle almost 4 centuries afterwards. Pocketing after a long and curious examination, he strode onward, finally pitching camp at an hour which he guessed to be the evening of the outer world. The next day, Zamacona rose early and resumed his descent through this blue-litten world of mist and desolation and preternatural silence. As he advanced, he at last became able to distinguish a few objects on the distant plain below. Trees, bushes, rocks, and a small river came into view from the right and curved forward at a point to the left of his contemplated course. This river seemed to be spanned by a bridge connected with the descending roadway, and with care the explorer could trace the route of the road beyond it in a straight line over the plain. Finally, even as he thought he could detect towns scattered along the reticular ribbon, towns whose left-hand edges reached the river and sometimes crossed it. Where such crossings occurred, he saw as he descended, there were always signs of bridges either ruined or surviving. He was now in the midst of a sparse, grassy vegetation, and saw below him the growth became thicker and thicker. The road was easier to define now, since its surface discouraged the grass which the looser soil supported. Rock fragments were less frequent, and the barren upward vista behind him looked bleak and forbidding in contrast with his present milieu. It was on this day he saw the blurred mass moving over the distant plain. Since his first sight of the sinister footprints, he had met with no more of these, but something about that slow and deliberate moving mass peculiarly, I don't know why I suddenly can't see this word, peculiarly sickened him. Nothing but a herd of grazing animals could move just like that, and after seeing the footprints he did not wish to meet the things which had made them. Still, the moving mass was not near the road, and his curiosity and greed for fabled gold were great. Besides, who could really judge things from vague, jumbled footprints, or from the panic-twisted hints of an ignorant Indian? In straining his eyes to the view on the moving mass, Zamacona became aware of several other interesting things. One was that certain parts of the now unmistakable towns glittered oddly in the misty blue light. Another was that, besides the towns, several similarly glittering structures of more isolated sort were scattered here and there, along the road and over the plain. They seemed to be embowered in clumps of vegetation, and those off-road had small avenues leading to the highway. No smoke or other life could be discerned about any of the towns or buildings. Finally, Zamacona saw that the plain was not infinite in extent, though half-concealing blue mists had hitherto made it seem so. It was bounded in a remote distance by a range of low hills toward a gap in which the river and road seemed to lead. All this, especially the glittering of certain pinnacles in the town, had become very vivid when Zamacona pitched his second camp amidst the endless blue day. He likewise noticed the flocks of high-soaring birds, whose nature he could not clearly make out. The next afternoon, to use language of the outer world as the manuscript did at all times, Zamacona reached the silent path and crossed the soundless, slow-running river on a curiously carved, fairly well-preserved bridge of black basalt. The water was clear and contained large fishes of a wholly strange aspect. The roadway was now paved and somewhat overgrown with weeds and creeping vines, and its course was occasionally outlined by small pillars bearing obscure symbols. On every side of the grassy level extended, here and there, a clump of trees or shrubbery, and with unidentifiable bluish flowers growing irregularly over the whole area. Now and then some spasmodic motion of the grass indicated the presence of serpents. In the course of several hours the traveler reached a grove of old and alien-looking evergreen trees, which he knew, from distant viewing, protected one of the glittering roofed, isolated structures. Amidst the encroaching vegetation he saw the hideously sculptured pylons of a stone gateway leading off the road, and was pleasantly forcing his way through briars above a moss-crusted, tessellated walk lined with huge trees and low monolithic pillars. At last, in this hushed green twilight, he saw the crumbling in an ineffably ancient facade of a building. A temple, he had no doubt. It was a mass of nauseous bas-relief depicting scenes and beings, objects and ceremonies, which could certainly have no place on this or any sane planet. In hinting of these scenes, Zamacona displays for the first time that shocked and pious hesitancy which impairs the informative value of the rest of his manuscript. We cannot help regretting that the Catholic ardor of Renaissance Spain had so thoroughly permeated his thoughts and feelings. The door of the place stood wide open, and absolute darkness filled the windowless interior. Conquering the repulsion which the mural sculptures had excited, Zamacona took out flint and steel, lighted a resinous torch, pushed aside the curtaining vines, and sallied boldly across the ominous threshold. For a moment he was quite stupefied by what he saw. It was not the all-covering dust and cobwebs of immemorial aeons, the fluttering winged things, the shrinkingly loathsome sculptures on the walls, the bizarre form of many basins and braziers, the sinister pyramidal altar with the hollow top, or the monstrous octopus-headed abnormality in some strange dark metal, leering and squatting broodingly on its hieroglyphed pedestal, which robbed him of even the power to give a startled cry. It was nothing so unearthly as this, but merely the fact that with the exception of the dust, the cobweb, the winged things, the gigantic emerald-eyed idol, every particle of substance in sight was composed of pure and evidently solid gold. Even the manuscript written in retrospect after Zamacona knew that gold is the most common structural metal of a netherworld containing limitless lodes and veins of it, reflects the frenzied excitement which the traveler felt upon suddenly finding the real source of all the Indian legends of golden cities. For a time the power of detailed observation left him, but in the end his faculties were recalled by a peculiar tugging sensation in the pocket of his doublet. Tracing the feeling, he realized that the disc of strange metal he had found in the abandoned road was being attracted strongly by the vast octopus-headed emerald-eyed idol on the pedestal, which he now saw to be composed of the same unknown exotic metal. He was later to learn that this strange magnetic substance, as alien to the inner world as to the outer world of men, is the one precious metal of the blue-lighted abyss. None knows what it is or where it occurs in nature, but the amount of it on this planet came down from the stars with the people when great Tulu, octopus-headed god, brought them for the first time to this earth. Certainly, its only known source was a stock of pre-existing artifacts, including multitudes of cyclopean idols. It could never be placed or analyzed, and even its magnetism was exerted only on its own kind. It was the supreme ceremonial metal of the hidden people, its use being regulated by custom in such a way that its magnetic properties might cause no inconvenience. A very weak magnetic alloy of it, which base metals as iron, gold, silver, copper, or zinc, had formed the sole monetary standard of the hidden people at one period of their history. Zamakona's reflection on the strange idol and its magnetism were disturbed by a tremendous wave of fear as, for the first time in the silent world, he heard a rumble of very definite and obviously approaching sound. There was no mistaking its nature. It was thunderous charging herd of large animals, and, remembering the Indians' panic, the footprints, and the moving mass distantly seen, the Spaniard shuddered in terrified anticipation. He did not analyze his position or the significance of this onrush of great lumbering beings, but merely responded to an elemental urge towards self-protection. Charging herds do not stop to find victims in obscure places, and on the outer earth Zamakona would have felt little or no alarm in such massive, grove-girt edifice. Some instinct, however, now bred in a deep and peculiar terror in his soul, and he looked about frantically for any means of safety. There being no available refuge in the great, gold-painted interior, he felt that he must close the long disused door which still hung on its ancient hinges, doubled back against the inner wall. Soil, vines, and moss had entered the opening from the outside, so that he had to dig a path for the great gold portal with his sword, but he managed to perform the work very swiftly and under frightful stimulus of the approaching noise. The hoofbeats had grown still louder and more menacing by the time he had begun tugging at the heavy door itself, and for while his fears reached a frantic height, his hope of starting the age-clogged metal grew faint. Then, with a creak, the thing responded to his youthful strength, and a frenzied siege of pulling and pushing ensued. Amidst the roar of an unseen stampeding feet, success came at last, and the ponderous golden door clanged shut, leaving Zamakona in darkness, but for the single lighted torch he had wedged between pillars of a basin tripod. There was a latch, and the frightened man blessed his patron saint that it was still effective. Sound alone told the fugitive the sequel. When the roar grew very near, it resolved itself into separate footfalls, as if the evergreen grove had made it necessary for the herd to slacken speed and disperse. But feet continued to approach, and it became evident that the beasts were advancing among the trees and circling the hideous carven temple walls. In the curious deliberation of their tread, Zamakona found something very alarming and repulsive, nor did he like the scuffling sounds which were audible even through the thick stone walls and heavy golden door. Once the door rattled ominously on its archaic hinges, as if under heavy impact. But fortunately, it still held. Then, after a seemingly endless interval, he heard retreating steps and realized that his unknown visitors were leaving. Still, the herds did not seem to be very numerous, and it would have perhaps been safe to venture out within an half hour or less, but Zamakona took no chances. Opening his pack, he prepared to camp on the golden tiles of the temple floor, with the great door still securely latched against all comers, drifting eventually into a sounder slumber than he could have known in the blue-litten spaces outside. He did not even mind the hellish octopus-headed bulk of Great Tulu, fashioned of unknown metal, leering with fishy sea-green eyes, and squatted in the blackness above him on its monstrously hieroglyphed pedestal. Surrounded by darkness for the first time since leaving the tunnel, Zamakona slept profoundly and long. He must have more than made up for the sleep he lost at the 2 previous camps, when the ceaseless glare of the sky had kept him awake despite his fatigue, for much distance was covered by other living feet while he lay in his healthy, dreamless rest. It is well that he rested deeply, for there were many strange things to be encountered in his next period of consciousness. And let's see how long this next part is. Because this story's pretty long. About 7-ish pages, I guess. Well, let's give it a start. If all else fails, we can end in the middle. What finally roused Zamakona was a thunderous rapping at the door. It beat through his dreams and dissolved all the lingering mists of drowsiness as soon as he knew what it was. There could be no mistake about it. It was a definite, human, and peremptory rapping, performed apparently with some metallic object, with all the measured quality of conscious thought or will behind it. As the awakening man rose clumsily to his feet, a sharp vocal note was added to the summons, someone calling out, not a musical voice, for a formula which the manuscript tries to represent is Oxy Gitkan Yikalex. Feeling sure that his visitors were men and not demons, and arguing that they could have no reason for considering him an enemy, Zamakona decided to face them openly and at once, and accordingly fumbled with the ancient latch till the golden door creaked open from the pressure of those outside. As the great portal swung back, Zamakona stood facing a group of about 20 individuals of an aspect not calculated to give him alarm. They seemed to be Indians, though their tasteful robes and trappings and swords were not such as he had seen among any of the tribes of the outer world, while their faces had many subtle differences from the Indian type. That they did not mean to be irresponsibly hostile was very clear, for instead of menacing him in any way, they merely probed him attentively and significantly with their eyes, as if they expected their gaze to open up some sort of communication. The longer he gazed, the more he seemed to know about them and their mission. For although no one had spoken since the vocal summons before the opening of the door, he found himself slowly realizing that they had come from the great city beyond the lower hills, mounted on animals, and that they had been summoned by animals who had reported his presence, that they were not sure what kind of person he was, or just where he had come from, but that they knew he must be associated with that dimly remembered outer world which they sometimes visited in curious dreams. How he read all this in the gaze of 2 or 3 leaders he could not possibly explain, though he learned why a moment later. As it was, he attempted to address the visitors in the Wichita dialect he had picked up from Charging Buffalo, and after this failed to draw a vocal reply, he successfully tried Aztec, Spanish, French, and Latin tongues, adding as many scraps of Lane, Greek, Galatian, and Portuguese, and of the babble peasant patois of his native Asturias, as his memory could recall. But not even this polyglot array, his entire linguistic stock, could bring a reply in kind. When, however, he paused in perplexity, one of the visitors began speaking in an utterly strange and rather fascinating language, whose sounds the Spaniard later had much difficulty in representing on paper. Upon his failure to understand this, the speaker first pointed to his own eyes, then to his forehead, then to his eyes again, as if commanding the other to gaze at him in order to absorb what he wanted to transmit. Zamacona, obeying, found himself rapidly in possession of certain information. The people, he learned, converse nowadays by means of unvocal radiation of thought, although he had formerly used a spoken language which still survived as the written tongue, into which they still dropped orally for tradition's sake, or when strong feeling demanded a spontaneous outlet. He could understand them merely by concentrating his attention upon their eyes, and could reply by summoning up a mental image of what he wished to say, and throwing the substance of this into his glance. When the thought speaker paused, apparently inviting a response, Zamacona tried his best to follow the prescribed pattern, but did not appear to succeed very well. So he nodded and tried to describe himself and his journey by signs. He pointed upward as if to the outer world, and then closed his eyes and made a sign as of a mole burrowing. Then he opened his eyes again and pointed downward in order to indicate his descent of the great slope. Experimentally, he blended a spoken word or two with his gestures. For example, pointing to himself successfully to himself and to all of the visitors and saying un hombre. Then pointing to himself alone and very carefully pronouncing his individual name, Panfilio de Zamacona. Before the strange conversation was over, a good deal of data had passed in both directions. Zamacona had begun to learn how to throw his thoughts, and likewise picked up several words of the region's archaic spoken language. His visitors, moreover, had absorbed many beginnings of an elementary Spanish vocabulary. Their own old language was utterly unlike anything the Spaniard had ever heard, although there were times later on when he was to fancy an infinitely remote linkage with the Aztec, as if the latter represented some far stage of corruption, or some very thin infiltration of loanwords. The underground world, Zamacona learned, bore an ancient name which the manuscript records as Zianian, which, from the writer's supplementary explanation and diacritical marks, could probably be best represented to Anglo-Saxon ears by the phonetic arrangement Kianyan. Okay, so I wasn't guessing that the first time, obviously. It's not surprising that this preliminary discourse did not go beyond the merest essentials, but those essentials were highly important. Zamacona learned that the people of Kianyan were almost infinitely ancient, and that they had come from a distant part of space where physical conditions are much like those of Earth. All of this, however, was legend now, and one could not say how much truth was in it, or how much worship was really due to the octopus-headed being Tulu, who had traditionally brought them hither, and whom they still reverenced for aesthetic reasons. But they knew of the outer world, and were indeed the original stock who had peopled it as soon as its crust was fit to live on. Between glacial ages, they had some remarkable surface civilizations, especially one at the South Pole near the mountain Kadath. At some time infinitely in the past, most of the outer world had sunk beneath the ocean, so that only a few refugees remained to bear the news to Kinyan. This was undoubtedly due to the wrath of the space devils hostile alike to men and to men's gods, for it bore out rumors of primordially earlier sinking which had submerged the gods themselves, including great Tulu, who lay prisoned and dreaming in the watery vaults of the cosmic city Relax. No man, not a slave of the space devils, it was argued, could live long on the outer earth, and it was decided all beings who remained there must be evilly connected. Accordingly, traffic with the lands of sun and starlight abruptly cease. Subterranean approaches to Kinyan, or such as could be remembered, were either blocked up or carefully guarded, and all encroachers were treated as dangerous spies and enemies. But this was long ago. With the passing of ages, fewer and fewer visitors came to Kinyan, and eventually sentries ceased to be maintained at the unblocked approaches. The mass of people forgot, except through distorted memories and myths, and some very singular dreams, that an outer world existed, though educated folks never ceased to recall the essential facts. The last visitors ever recorded, centuries in the past, had not even been treated as devil spies, faith in the old legendary having long before died out. They had been questioned eagerly about the fabulous outer regions, for scientific curiosity in Kinyan was keen, and the myths, memories, dreams, and historical fragments relating to Earth's surface had often tempted scholars to the brink of an external expedition, which they had not quite dared to attempt. The only thing demanded of such visitors was that they refrain from going back and informing the outer world of Kinyan's positive existence. For after all, one could not be sure about these outer lands. They coveted gold and silver, and might prove highly troublesome intruders. Those who had obeyed the injunction had lived happily, though regrettably briefly, and had been told all they could about their world. Little enough, however, since their accounts were all so fragmentary and conflicting that one could hardly tell what to believe and what to doubt. One wished that more of them would come. As for those who disobeyed and tried to escape, it was very unfortunate about them. Zamacona himself was very welcome, for he appeared to be a higher grade man, and to know much more about the outer world than anyone else who had come down within memory. He could tell them much, and they hoped he would be reconciled to his lifelong stay. Many things which Zamacona learned about Kinyan was in that first colloquy left him quite breathless. He learned, for example, that during the past few thousand years of the phenomena of old age and death had been conquered, so that men no longer grew feeble or died, except through violence or will. By regulating the system, one might be physiologically young and immortal as he wished, and the only reason why any allowed themselves to age was that they enjoyed the sensation in a world where stagnation and commonplaceness resigned. But they could easily become young again when they felt like it. Births had ceased, except for experimental purposes, since a large population had been found needlessly by a master race which controlled nature and organic rivals alike. Many, however, chose to die after a while, since despite the cleverest efforts to invent new pleasures, the ordeal of consciousness had become too dull for sensitive souls, especially in whom time and satiation had blinded the primal instincts and emotions of self-preservation. All the members of the group before Zamacona were from 500 to 1500 years old, and several had seen surface visitors before, though time had blurred the recollection. These visitors, by the way, had often tried to duplicate the longevity of the underground race, but had been able to do so only fractionally, owing to evolutionary differences developing during the million or two of cleavage, whatever. These evolutionary differences were even more strikingly shewn in another particular, one far stranger than the wonder of immortality itself. This was the ability of the people of Kinyan to regulate the balance between matter and abstract energy, even where the bodies of living organic beings were concerned, by the sheer force of technically trained will. In other words, with suitable effort, a learned man of Kinyan could dematerialize and rematerialize himself, or, with somewhat greater effort and subtler technique, any other object he chose, reducing solid matter to free external particles and recombining the particles again without damage. Had not Zamacona answered his visitor's knocks when he did, he would have discovered this accomplishment in a highly puzzling way, for only the strain and bother of the process prevented the 20 men from passing boldly through the golden doors without pausing for a summons. This art was much older than the art of perpetual life, and it could be taught to some extent, though never perfectly, to any intelligent person. Rumors of it had reached the outer world in past eons, surviving in secret editions and ghostly legendary. Whatever. The men of Kinyan had been amused by the primitive and imperfect spirit tales brought down by the outerward stragglers. In practical life, this principle had certain industrial applications, but was generally suffered to remain neglected through lack of any particular incentive to its use. Its chief surviving form was in connection with sleep, for when excitement's sake, many dream connoisseurs resorted to it to enhance the vividness of their visionary wanderings. By the aid of this method, certain dreamers even paid half-material visits to a strange, nebulous realm of mounds and valleys in varying light, which some believed to be forgotten outer world. They would go thither on their beasts, and in the age of peace live over the old glorious battles of their forefathers. Some philosophers thought that in such cases they actually coalesced with immaterial forces left behind by these warlike ancestors themselves. The people of Kinyan all dwelt in the great, tall city of Sath, beyond the mountains. Formerly, several races of them had inhabited the entire underground world, which stretched down to the unfathomable abyss, and still included beside the blue-litten region, a red-litten region called Yoth, where relics of a still older and non-human race were found by archaeologists. In the course of time, however, the men of Sath had conquered and enslaved the rest, interbreeding them with certain horned and four-footed animals of the red-litten region, and whose semi-human leanings were very peculiar, and which, though containing a certain artificially created element, may have been in part the degenerated descendants of those particular entities who had left the relics. The eons passed, and mechanical discoveries made the business of life extremely easy. A concentration of the people Sath took place, so that the rest of the Kinyan became relatively deserted. It was easier to live in one place, and there was no object in maintaining a population of overflowing proportion. Many of the old mechanical devices were still in use, though others had been abandoned when it was seen that they failed to give pleasure, or that they were not necessary for a race of reduced numbers whose mental force could govern an extensive array of inferior and semi-human industrial organisms. The extensive slave class was highly composite, being bred from ancient conquered enemies, from outer world stragglers, from dead bodies curiously galvanized into effectiveness, and from the naturally inferior members of the ruling race of Sath. Hey, Shane. The ruling type itself had become highly superior through selective breeding and social evolution, the notion having passed through a period of idealistic industrial democracy, which gave equal opportunities to all, and thus, by raising the naturally intelligent to power, drained the masses of all their brains and stamina. Oh my God, that sounds familiar. Industry being found fundamentally futile except for supplying of basic needs and the gratification of inescapable earnings, had become very simple. Physical comfort was ensured by an urban mechanism of standardized and easily maintained pattern, and other elemental needs were supplied by scientific agriculture and stock raising. Long travel was abandoned, and people went back to using the horned, half-human beasts instead of maintaining the profusion of gold, silver, and steel transportation machines which had once threaded land, water, and air. Zamacona could scarcely believe such a thing had ever existed outside dreams, but was told he could see specimens of them in museums. He could also see the ruins of other vast magical devices by traveling a day's journey to the valley of Dohana, to which the race had spread during its period of greatest numbers. The cities and temples of this present plane were of far more archaic period, and had never been other than religious and antiquarian shrines during the supremacy of the men at Sath. In government, Sath was a kind of communistic or semi-anarchical state, habit rather than law determining the daily order of things. This was made possible by the age-old experience and paralyzing ennui of the race, whose wants and needs were limited to physical fundamentals and to new sensations. An aeon-long tolerance, not yet undetermined by growing reaction, had abolished all illusion of value and principles, and nothing but an approximation to custom was ever sought or expected. To see that the mutual encroachment of pleasure-seeking never crippled the mass life of the community. This is all that was desired. Family organizations had long ago perished, and the civil and social distinction of the sexes had disappeared. Daily life was organized in ceremonial patterns with games, intoxications, torture of slaves, daydreaming, gastronomic and emotional orgies, religious exercise, exotic experiments, artistic and philosophical discussions, and the like, as the principal occupations. Property, chiefly land, slaves, animals, shares in the common city enterprise of South, and ingots of magnetic Tulu metal, the former universal monetary standard, was allocated on a very complex basis, which included a certain amount of equally divided among all the free men. Poverty was unknown, and labor consisted only of certain administrative duties imposed by an intricate system of testing and selection. Zamacona found it difficult in describing conditions so unlike anything he had previously known, and the text of his manuscript proved unusually puzzling at this point. Art and intellect, it appeared, had reached very high levels in South, but had become listless and decadent. The dominance of machinery had at one time broken up the growth of normal aesthetics, introducing a lifeless geometrical tradition fatal to sound expression. This had soon been outgrown, but had left its mark upon all pictorial and decorative attempts, so that except for conventionalized religious design, there was little depth or feeling in any later work. Archaistic reproductions of earlier work had been found much preferable for general enjoyment. Literature was all highly individual and analytical, so much as to be wholly incomprehensible to Zamacona. Science had been profound and accurate, and all-embracing save the one direction of astronomy. Of late, however, it was falling into decay as people found it increasingly useless to tax their minds by recalling maddening infinitude of details and ramifications. It was thought more sensible to abandon the deepest speculations, to confine philosophy to its conventional forms. Technology, of course, could be carried on by rule of thumb. History was more and more neglected, but exact and copious chronicles of the past existed in libraries. It was still an interesting subject, and there would be vast numbers to rejoice at the fresh outer-world knowledge brought in by Zamacona. In general, though, the modern tendency was to feel rather than to think, so that men were now more highly esteemed for inventing new diversions than for preserving old facts, or pushing back the frontier of cosmic mystery. Religion was a leading interest in Seth, though very few actually believed in the supernatural. What was desired was the aesthetic and emotional exaltation bred by the mystical moods and sensuous rites which attended the colorful ancestral faith. Temples to Great Tulu, a spirit of universal harmony, anciently symbolized as the octopus-headed god who had brought all men down from the stars, were the most richly constructed objects in all of Kinyan, while the cryptic shrines of Yig, the principle of life symbolized as the father of all serpents, were almost as lavish and remarkable. Excuse me. In time, Zamacona learned much of the orgies and sacrifices connected with this religion, but seemed piously reluctant to describe them in his manuscript. He himself never participated in any of the rites, save those for which he mistook for perversions of his own faith, nor did he ever lose an opportunity to convert the people to the faith of the cross, which the Spaniards hoped to make universal. Prominent in the contemporary religion of South was a revived and almost genuine reverence for the rare sacred metal of Tulu, the dark, lustrous, magnetic stuff which was found nowhere in nature, but which had always been with men in the form of idols and hierarchic implements. From the earliest times, any sign of it in its unalloyed form had impelled respect, while all the sacred archives and litanies were kept in cylinders wrought of its purest substance. Now, the neglect of science and intellect was dulling the critically analytic spirit. People were beginning to weave around the middle once more the same fabric of awestruck superstition which had existed in primitive times. Another function of religion was the regulation of the calendar, born of the period when time and speed were regarded as prime fetishes in man's emotional life. Periods of alternate waking and sleeping, prolonged, abridged, and inverted as mood and convenience dictated, and timed by the tail beats of great Yig the serpent, corresponded very roughly to terrestrial days and nights, though Zamacona's sensation told him they must actually be almost twice as long. The year unit, measured by Yig's annual shedding of his skin, was equal to about a year and a half of the outer world. Zamacona thought he had mastered the calendar very well when he wrote the manuscript, whence the confidently given date of 1545, but the document failed to suggest that his assurance in this matter was fully justified. As the spokesman of the South Party proceeded with his information, Zamacona felt a growing repulsion and alarm. It was not only what he was told, but the strange telepathic manner of telling, and the plain inferences that the return to the outer world would be impossible, that made the Spaniard wish he had never descended to this region of magic, abnormality, and decadence. But he knew that nothing but friendly acquiescence would do as a policy, hence decided to cooperate in all his visitors' plans and furnish all the information they might desire. They, on their part, were fascinated by outer world data which he managed to haltingly convey. It was really the first draught of reliable surface information they had had since the refugees straggled back from Atlantis and Lemura aeons before, for all their subsequent emissaries from outside had been members of narrow and local groups without any knowledge of the world at large. Mayas, Toltecs, and Aztecs at best, and mostly ignorant tribes of the plains. Zamacona was the first European they had ever seen, and the fact that he was a youth of education and brilliancy made him of still more emphatic value as a source of knowledge. The visiting party shewed their breathless interest in all he contrived to convey, and it was plain that his coming would do much to relieve the flagging interest of wary South in matters of geography and history. The only thing which seemed to displease the men of South was the fact that curious and adventurous strangers were beginning to pour into those parts of the upper world where the passages to Yan lay. Zamacona told them of the founding of Florida and New Spain, and made it clear that a great part of the world was stirring with the zest of adventure. Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English. Sooner or later, Mexico and Florida must meet in one great colonial empire. And then it would be hard to keep outsiders from the rumored gold and silver of the abyss. Charging Buffalo knew of Zamacona's journey into the earth. Would he tell Coronado, or somehow let a report get to the great viceroy when he failed to find the traveler at the promised meeting place? Alarm for the continued secrecy and safety of Yan shewed in the faces of the visitors, and Zamacona absorbed from their minds the fact that from now on sentries would undoubtedly be posted once more at all the unblocked passages to the outside world, which the men of the South could remember. Okay. Gotta give it a break now, because I'm not sure how much further this story goes. But it is not a short one. So, Jesus Christ. Let's see here. 257, 235. Yeah, we got another 20-something-ish pages. 22-ish pages left to go. So, I do believe we'll probably wrap it up next week then. But yeah, definitely time for a quiet break. Thank you guys for being here tonight. I'm sure Wookie's in bed, but I want to again thank him for dropping those 20 memberships. Dear God, that's very kind of him. Thank you to everybody who has subscribed so far. I will be putting together something to put at the end of these streams and any videos I do to thank people for their support. I know Silver Ogre, Mr. Grant Gregory, and Sleazy, I believe, all have their own memberships. Smokey as well. Yes, Smokey as well. Metastep. Just the ones I can recall off the top of my head. I will get a better list together in the future. But yeah. I will be on tomorrow night. Apparently, they put out a new update in Timberborn. So I may play with some beaver tomorrow night. We'll see. It'll either be beaver or sinking city, I think, is how we're gonna go. So, that's it. Neverwinter Nights on Saturday. Doing something on Sunday. I don't remember what I'm doing on Sunday. But I'll figure it out on Sunday. Monday was Star Sand. We should be doing the midweek hump again tomorrow or this Wednesday, since people should be better by then. And hopefully, with luck, I'll see a bunch of you in Vegas, since they finally, Geeks and Gamers and Neurotic finally mentioned that the meetup will be the second week of April in Las Vegas at the Millennium Fandom Bar. Fandom Millennium. I don't remember it right now, but it's on Twitter. You can go find that information. But they'll release the exact date after they get back from MegaCon. So, anyway, thank you guys for being here. I really appreciate it. Have a very good evening. Have some sweet dreams. Don't go wandering around and getting sucked down into the underground tunnels. And I'll catch you later. Good night.